If your last name is Ross, Vann, Ridge, Rogers, or Adair, hear this. These are not random Cherokee names. They are surnames that ended up on opposite sides of a betrayal so deep it caused assassinations, a civil war split, and a forced death march west. The band your family came from was never random. It was decided by choices made 200 years ago, choices some families never spoke of again. And the final name on this list belonged to a man who signed a treaty, buried his cousins, then wore a Confederate uniform after the war had ended. Number 10. Mayfield. On the surface, it sounds like an English farm name, and that is exactly why so many people miss what it carries. Cherokee Mayfields appear again and again on 19th-century tribal rolls, tied to trading families who moved into the Cherokee Nation before removal even began. Many Mayfield households are found among the old settlers, the Cherokees who migrated west into Arkansas and later Indian Territory, years before the Trail of Tears forced everyone else to follow. That is not a small detail. It means some Mayfields were already building towns in the West, while other bands were still being marched at gunpoint. The name looks ordinary. The timing behind it is not. If this is your surname, the old settlement records may place your family in the story before the tragedy most people think defines it. Old settler Mayfields often intermarried with other early Western families, forming a network that later negotiated directly with federal agents on behalf of the Western Cherokee before the Eastern majority ever arrived. That gave them a strange kind of leverage. They were not fleeing removal. They were already positioned when it happened, watching thousands of their own people arrive broken by a journey they themselves had avoided years earlier. But the deeper twist is coming, because the next family did not just move west early. They tried to hold political power once they got there. Number 9. Foreman. This name shows up constantly in the printed pages of the Cherokee Advocate, the tribal newspaper, and in the political records of the Cherokee Nation West. Foreman households were part of the National Party faction, the political wing that formed around the leadership that eventually settled in Indian Territory. Being tied to this name meant being tied to committees, courts, and the machinery that tried to rebuild a nation from exile. The proof anchor here is unusually strong, because Foreman's signatures and testimonies appear directly in council records and legal disputes preserved from that era. The twist is that political power in the new territory did not erase old wounds. It often reopened them, because the men rebuilding the government were sometimes the same men accused of helping cause the removal in the first place. Foreman households sat inside courtrooms and council chambers where old grievances from the Trail of Tears were argued out for decades, long after the physical journey itself had ended. If your family carried this name, it may have sat closer to power than most Cherokee families ever did, and closer to blame as well. The next name belonged to people who chose a very different kind of power. Number 8. Christy. This surname is tied closely to the Kiowa tradition, the older, more spiritually conservative current within Cherokee society that resisted rapid assimilation into American political and religious systems. Christy families appear in accounts connected to Kiowa gatherings and traditionalist resistance during the pressures of allotment decades later. That matters because it shows a very different kind of survival than treaty politics. It is cultural survival, protecting language, ceremony, and identity, while surrounding institutions pushed hard against it. The twist is that traditionalist families were often painted by outsiders as the least powerful, when in reality they preserved the very core the rest of the nation eventually had to return to. Kiowa gatherings kept ceremonial fires, sacred formulas, and clan structure alive through decades when American officials pushed hard for total assimilation, land allotment, and the dissolution of tribal government itself. Families carrying the Christy name were part of the quiet resistance that made sure there was still a Cherokee culture left to rebuild once the political storms finally passed. If your family carried this name, the old ceremonial grounds may mean more to your history than any courthouse record. The next name belonged to a man who tried to reunite everything the split had broken apart. Number 7. Downing. Lewis Downing carried this name into the office of Principal Chief after the Civil War tore the Cherokee Nation in two. He was a Kiowa leader who worked to reunify Union and Confederate Cherokee factions into a single functioning government again. Downing families are documented in post-war Reconstruction records of the Cherokee Nation, tied directly to reconciliation efforts after a war that had turned Cherokee against Cherokee. That is the twist people rarely expect. The most brutal chapter for this nation was not only removal decades earlier, it was a second civil war fought internally, and the Downing name sits at the center of trying to heal it. Downing worked to merge the Union and Confederate factions of the Cherokee Nation into one government, negotiating with families who had buried relatives on opposite sides of the same battlefield only a few years before. That kind of reconciliation rarely makes it into dramatic retellings, but it may have saved the nation from permanent collapse. The next family sits on the opposite side of that same war, and their choice came with a much darker price. Number 6. Bell. John Bell was among the men who signed the controversial Treaty of New Echota, the document that authorized Cherokee removal without the approval of the elected national government. Bell households afterward tended to align with pro-Confederate sentiment during the Civil War, continuing a pattern of siding with power against the nation's own leadership. Bell is a common English surname, and that is exactly why its Cherokee branch surprises people. It is not hidden in exotic phonetics. It is hidden in plain English letters, attached to one of the most consequential political decisions in Cherokee history. The proof anchor is the treaty record itself, still studied today as the legal foundation for forced removal. Bell descendants later appear in Confederate muster records during the Civil War, a continuation of the same alignment their family had chosen a generation earlier under very different circumstances. That consistency is rare. Most families shift loyalties as pressures change, but the Bell name shows a pattern that held steady through two separate national crises, decades apart. The next name belonged to a family so wealthy and so mixed into elite Cherokee society that most people never picture it as Cherokee at all. Number 5. Rogers. This is one of the most famous Cherokee surnames in America, carried by prominent mixed-blood planter families in the old Cherokee Nation before removal, and later carried into fame by the entertainer Will Rogers, who was of documented Cherokee descent through this line. Rogers households appear in early plantation and property records, showing a family that operated inside elite economic circles rather than traditional subsistence life. The twist is uncomfortable but real. Some of the wealthiest Cherokee families operated large farms using enslaved labor, mirroring the plantation economy of the surrounding South. Power did not always mean protection from controversy. It often meant deeper entanglement in it. Rogers' family estates operated with the same cash crop economy found across the antebellum South, and that reality sits uncomfortably alongside the family's later fame through Will Rogers, remembered warmly as a folksy American entertainer, while the plantation-era roots behind his Cherokee ancestry are rarely mentioned at all. If this name is in your family, the old property and probate records may reveal far more about your ancestors than a simple family tree ever could. The next family goes back even further, into the earliest trading world of the Cherokee towns themselves. Number 4. Adair. James Adair was an 18th-century trader who lived among the Overhill Cherokee towns, and later wrote one of the earliest detailed accounts of Cherokee life, trade, and diplomacy from an outsider's perspective. Cherokee Adair families descend from generations of intermarriage between Scottish and Irish traders and Cherokee clan mothers, a pattern that shaped an entire class of interpreters, negotiators, and go-betweens. That role was not decorative. Interpreters and traders often controlled the flow of information between Cherokee leadership and colonial and later American officials. The twist is that this name looks foreign at first glance, but it became deeply rooted inside Cherokee political life for well over a century. Adair descendants continued serving as negotiators, translators, and government officials generations after James Adair himself had died, carrying a role that outlasted the very colonial powers that first created the need for it. The name does not prove every modern bearer descends from that one trader, but historically it belongs to a surname tradition tied directly to Cherokee diplomacy at its highest levels. If you carry this name, the surname tradition reaches back into a world before the United States even existed. The next family built something so valuable, it became a target. Number 3. Vann. James Vann built one of the wealthiest estates in the entire Cherokee Nation, a brick mansion still standing today, known as Diamond Hill, supported by trade routes, ferries, and plantation land in what is now northern Georgia. Vann households are documented in Moravian missionary records, tax rolls, and property disputes from the early 1800s. This was not a quiet family. James Vann was killed in 1809 in an act of violence tied to the very rivalries his wealth and influence provoked. That is the twist. Extreme power inside a small nation created extreme danger because enemies were never far away, and land, money, and political influence made the Vann name both admired and resented. His son Joseph Vann inherited the estate and expanded it further, only to eventually lose it entirely when Georgia state authorities seized Cherokee land ahead of removal using state law to strip a Cherokee family of a fortune built over 2 generations. If this surname is yours, the surviving mansion is not decoration. It is a document made of brick, still standing as proof. The next name belonged to the man who led an entire nation through its darkest forced migration. Number 2. Ross. John Ross served as principal chief through the removal era, leading what became known as the National Party, the faction that fought for years in American courts and in Washington to stop the forced removal of the Cherokee people from their homeland. When removal came anyway, Ross led the majority of the nation on the march that became known as the Trail of Tears, a journey that killed thousands from exposure, disease, and starvation. Ross households are documented extensively in National Council records, correspondence, and the surviving Cherokee Nation archives from that period. The twist is political, not personal. Ross opposed removal until the end, yet history placed his name permanently at the center of the very tragedy he tried hardest to prevent. Ross led the National Party for decades, longer than almost any Cherokee leader before or since, guiding the nation through removal, resettlement, and the internal civil war that followed, dying in office while still serving as principal chief. If this surname is in your family, the old council records place your name inside the nation's most documented resistance to its own destruction. But the final name on this list belonged to men who chose the opposite path, and one of them never stopped fighting, even after the war that followed was already lost. Number 1. Ridge, carried into infamy through Major Ridge, his son John Ridge, and his nephew Stand Watie. The Ridge family, along with a small group of leaders, signed the Treaty of New Echota in 1835 without authorization from the elected Cherokee government, believing removal was unavoidable and that negotiating early would save more lives than resisting. The National Party saw it as betrayal. In 1839, after the Trail of Tears had already killed thousands, Major Ridge and John Ridge were assassinated by men connected to the opposing faction, a blood debt tied directly to that signature. But the name did not end there. Stand Watie, Ridge's nephew, went on to become a Confederate brigadier general during the Civil War, commanding Cherokee troops and becoming the last Confederate general in the entire war to formally surrender. In June of 1865, months after the war had already ended everywhere else. This single surname carries treaty politics, family assassination, Civil War command, and one of the most documented endings in American military history, all attached to one bloodline. Watie did not simply serve in the Confederate Army. He led Cherokee cavalry through years of border warfare in Indian Territory, fighting a war within a war while carrying a family name already stained by his uncles' and cousins' assassinations decades earlier. He surrendered his command near Dokesville in June of 1865, formally closing the last active Confederate resistance anywhere in the country, months after Robert E. Lee and even after the fall of the Confederacy's own government. That single surrender turned a regional family feud into a documented footnote of national history. If this name is yours, the old treaty pages, the council minutes, and the surrender records all lead back to the same family, and that family changes the scale of everything on this list. Surnames like these were never just labels stamped onto mailboxes and legal papers. They were compressed histories, carrying the weight of treaties signed under pressure, marches that killed the innocent, wars fought inside a single nation, and reunification attempts that came only after unbearable loss. A name that looks plain in English letters might once have meant a seat on a council, a plantation built on contested land, an assassination carried out for a signature, or a surrender that closed the final chapter of a war most of the country had already forgotten. These names did not simply survive history. They carried it, generation after generation, whether the families holding them ever knew it or not. 10 surnames, 10 different doors into the same nation, and every single one of them opens onto conflict, migration, and survival, instead of a clean, simple story. That is what makes Cherokee family history so different from the version most people expect. There was no single band, no single choice, and no single side. There were families who left early, families who stayed and fought politically, families who preserved ceremony in the shadows, families who profited, families who negotiated, and families who eventually took up arms against each other. Every one of those paths still has descendants living today, many of whom have no idea which corridor of history their own name walked through. If one of these surnames belongs to you or to someone in your family line, put it in the comments, along with whatever origin story, region, or migration your family has always told. Tell us which forgotten name, clan, or bloodline you want decoded next, because there is always another name still waiting to be opened, still carrying a kingdom, a war, or a survival story that has never been told out loud.